At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. Described as the sunniest corner in Greece, the Dodecanese group comprises 12 larger islands with numerous smaller ones dotted in between. Here are the sparkling beaches that make these islands one of the most popular tourist destinations in the Mediterranean. But these islands also have a rich cultural variety, born out of a long and sometimes tumultuous history. Much of this history parallels what was happening on the mainland. So these islands were first inhabited and civilized through the archaic and classical periods, eventually becoming part of the voracious Roman Empire. Following its demise in the 4th century AD, there was nearly a millennium of Byzantine rule. Subsequent periods of control by the Venetians, the Catholic Knights Hospitaller, the Ottomans and the Italians have all left their distinctive marks on the Dodecanese Islands. Dominating the central harbour area, the medieval old town is one of the finest examples in Europe, earning a listing as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. The fortifications are Byzantine in origins, but the Knights Hospitaller, who arrived on Rhodes in 1309, undertook a massive program of upgrading and expansion, eventually creating 3 lines of solid defence. Particularly fascinating is the Street of the Knights, lined with the hostels called the Inns of the Tongues, where each of the 7 different nationalities of the order stayed. Each bears the respective tongues emblem, carved in stone above the arched entrance.
In the 7th century AD, a group was formed in Jerusalem to look after the sick and ill pilgrims who had managed to make their way to the Holy City. And in the aftermath of the First Crusade in the 11th century, that group was transformed from a group of doctors into a military fighting force whose job it was to protect the pilgrims and protect Christendom's hold over the Holy Lands. These were the Knights Hospitaller. And their power and influence grew in the Levant and the Holy Land exponentially over the following centuries. But then, in the 13th century, they were chased out of the Holy Land by the Ottoman Turks. They needed a new base. First, they landed on Cyprus, but soon their eyes turned to the island of Rhodes, and in 1309, they took the island by force. The city of Rhodes on Rhodes was, as a result, transformed into a medieval fortress, and there the knights, now called the Knights of Rhodes, remained until the 16th century, when in 1522 they were once again chased from their homes by the Ottoman Turks.
Head a little further south and the road takes you to Lindos. Surely the realization of everybody's imaginings of the classic whitewashed Greek village hugging an ocean of brilliant blue. In fact, Lindos is built around not one, but 2 equally beautiful bays, so there are 2 stretches of beach to choose from. The more sheltered of these inlets is called St. Paul's Bay, and it's claimed the apostle took refuge here from a storm in AD 43, and by happy accident bringing Christianity to the island of Rhodes. While there isn't much evidence to back up this story, Paul certainly would have sailed through these waters on both his 2nd and 3rd missionary journeys, passing quite close to Rhodes, so it might have happened. And one legacy is a very pretty little chapel dedicated to the apostle, nestling at the base of the Acropolis. While the beaches are a major attraction of Lindos, its spectacular ancient acropolis is well worth a visit too. Rising to 120 meters above the village, access is by long flights of stone steps ending in a vaulted corridor. There's a lot to see up here, including the remaining columns of a stoa, originating from around 200 BC, and a propylaeum or monumental gateway dating from the 5th century BC. Beyond are the ruins of the Temple of Athena of Lindos, the most important on the site, and from 300 BC.
The Acropolis on the eastern end of the island of Rhodes is dedicated to the goddess Athena and particularly to Athena Lindia. Now, this was an incredible sanctuary and a very savvy one by my bet. It had a beautiful temple and other sanctuary architecture, but then in about the 1st century BC, it suffered a disaster. Everything that it owned was burnt by fire. And as a result, what could this sanctuary say to those coming to the island about its former glory? Their answer was a brilliant one. They started writing inventory lists of every dedication that had ever been bought by anyone in the past. And basically, they made it up. Every single important character in the whole of Greek mythology and Greek history supposedly had turned up to the Acropolis of Athena Lindia and dedicated something in the sanctuary. The Romans, when they started coming, took note of these lists and wanted to be on them themselves. And so this brilliant history continued right the way through into the 14th century AD, when the new owners of Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of Rhodes, decided to turn the Acropolis of Athena Lindia into a new fortress.
Sharp-eyed film buffs may recognize that scenes from the Guns of Navarone were filmed here, although the movie's plot is actually inspired by the Battle of Leros, which took place during the Dodecanese campaign in the Second World War. The real island of Leros is at the northern end of the Dodecanese group and possesses the largest natural harbour in the eastern Mediterranean. During the 1930s, the Italians turned it into a naval base, and Mussolini subsequently positioned both ships and seaplanes here during the Second World War. Gun emplacements were put in place to defend the base, and when Italy changed sides in July 1943, a British force arrived as reinforcements. The Battle of Leros took place during the following September, as the Germans mounted many attempts to take the island. Remains of the gun batteries can still be seen on the island's cliffs, but today these are very serene locations and perfect places to watch another magical Aegean sunset. Today, Leros is a very peaceful place, its landscapes punctuated by little whitewashed chapels, like this beautiful little example, the church of Aios Isidros, built on a rocky islet on the Gulf of Kokali. In bad weather or high seas, it's often cut off from shore. The capital of Leros, Aia Marina, is notable for its distinctly Italianate architectural style, although you'll still find plenty of traditional whitewashed cottages in the neighbouring villages of Platanos and Pandeli. Aia Marina is a port too, and its beautiful harbour's entrance is flanked by an old Roman fort called the Bruzzi, and an historical windmill which almost appears to be rising straight out of the water and can be seen from all parts of the island. Towering over all of it is the brooding presence of the Castro tis Panagias, the Castle of the Virgin Mary. Again, Byzantine in origins and later modified by the Knights Hospitaller. Built into the west side of the fortress is the 17th century Panagia Church, also dedicated to Mary. Secluded beaches, gentle green hills, olive groves and pine forests endow Leros with a great natural beauty, and it's often described as Greece's secret paradise. And from any high point in the distance to the north can be seen the island of Patmos, which is only a short ferry ride away. Patmos is known variously as the Island of the Apocalypse, the Holy Island, or the Jerusalem of the Aegean. These are all references to the most famous of its historical residents, the Apostle John, who was exiled here in AD 95 by the pagan Roman Emperor Domitian. Patmos is remote by any measure, although its popularity with both tourists and Christian pilgrims alike means it's a lot easier to get to than when John was left to languish here. There are direct connections with Rhodes and Athens, as well as links to the other main islands in the Dodecanese group. This remoteness is the very reason the Romans in particular used Patmos as a place to exile political and religious dissidents. Patmos is a small island, but there's still a lot to see, much of it related to St. John. In fact, on this tiny island, there are said to be a total of 365 churches. There's also a remarkable variety of landscapes for such a small area, from wind-blown hills to calm coves, rocky outcrops to smooth beaches, and dry, barren slopes to lush groves of citrus trees, olives, and vines. But beyond the physical, this island has a mystical quality and a tranquil beauty that's spellbinding, especially when the sun is setting, bathing everything in soft, warm hues. In fact, walking up the steep hill from the shore to the cave where John was exiled is a most moving and spiritual experience. The first settlement dates back to 2000 BC, but it was the Ionians who brought a higher level of civilization in the 4th century, establishing a port town now called Scala, with an acropolis on the nearby Castelli Hill. Patmos developed into a trading center, but once the Romans took control in the 2nd century AD, it was better known as a place of exile. But one exile, John, would have a significant influence on the island's future right up to today. Almost 1,000 years after John, a monk called Christodolos came here in 1088 from the island of Kos, seeking solitude in the tranquility of Patmos. He wrote, "The loneliness of the island made me jump for joy." With the blessing of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, Christodolos established a small monastery dedicated to the apostle, although he died before it could be completed. His followers finished the job, and this monastery was subsequently considered so sacred that it was even respected by the invading Ottomans and allowed to continue. Today, the fortress monastery dominates the skyline behind the narrow bay of Scala, its forbidding grey stone walls contrasting dramatically with the bright white of the houses in the surrounding village of Chora. When John was on Patmos, it wasn't uncommon for the exiles to live in one of the many caves on the island. It needs to be remembered that he was well into his 80s and most likely no longer capable of building a proper dwelling. A cave would have been a welcome refuge, if perhaps an uncomfortable one. Today, the Monastery of the Apocalypse stands over the cave where John is thought to have lived. Over the entrance to the cave is an inscription which reads, "As dreadful as this place is, it is nevertheless the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." In the cool darkness of this cave, John began seeing the visions that have subsequently formed the most controversial and most debated writings in the entire Holy Bible, the Book of Revelation. These visions were prophetic and told of the end of times, using symbolism that would have been understood by the readers of the day and surrealism that has remained open to different interpretations ever since. At the start of the Book of Revelation, John writes, "I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, 'Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches.'" In Greek, the word apocalypsis means revelation, and its English derivation, apocalypse, has come to imply destruction and devastation. God's revelation to John was essentially a message of hope. At least for the faithful who were promised that their persecutors would be destroyed, while they would be rewarded with eternal life. In the cave chapel can be seen the niche carved into the rock where John rested his head, and another which he used to pull himself up after waking. Another reminder that he was a very old man. For the many thousands of pilgrims who visit here every year, this is a very sacred spot. In the low ceiling are the clearly discernible fissures in the rock through which, according to tradition, John heard the voice of God. The wall paintings are from the 12th century, but were only discovered in 1973 when whitewash was removed. It's considered such a crucially important place in Christianity that a priest lives, sleeps, and stands guard here all year round, taking his appointed role very seriously. The current incumbent has been doing the job for over 20 years. Away from the bright Aegean light and the noises of everyday life, this quiet cave really concentrates the senses on the story of Revelation with its message of reassurance for believers. No wonder it's considered such a significant and sacred place in Christianity. Services are held here by the resident priest every day, and to attend one is a very moving experience.
Now, fairly soon after John's death, that cave started to become a place of Christian pilgrimage. And by about the 4th century AD, there seems to have been a church there to help celebrate the sanctity of the spot. But Patmos's history over the subsequent centuries was a very difficult one, as it was thrown between the different powers that controlled the Aegean. And it wasn't until the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th century, that we actually get a monastery there to celebrate the sanctity of the place, the monastery that still survives to this day.
The village of Chora is clustered around the fortified monastery. It's full of tiny squares and courtyards, narrow alleyways just waiting to be explored, beautifully restored period homes, and the promise of stunning views from every vantage point. Closer to the monastery, Chora's architecture is predominantly Byzantine and has been the subject of much study because of its particular character and style. These houses were built by refugees from the sacking of Constantinople in 1453, and so their urban-like density is unusual for what was then an entirely rural environment. Further down the slopes, the character changes again as many of the buildings are freestanding mansions built in the 16th and 17th centuries during the Ottoman occupation. Most originally sat in large gardens, which have subsequently been occupied by smaller homes. The monastery itself feels very much like the refuge it was originally intended to be. While the outside world can be viewed in all its glory from the top of the walls, down in the courtyards and sheltered spaces, the focus is inward-looking and more contemplative. The interior of the main church is dominated by a carved wooden iconostasi, breathtaking in its intricacy and detail. It's early 19th century, but the building is the original, completed in 1095. The many chandeliers and lamps are made from silver, while the floor slabs are marble. On the roof terrace is the small domed chapel of the Holy Cross, built in 1558 and made from rough-cut stone. From up here, the whole of Patmos is spread out before you. A church of rather smaller proportions, but considered no less important in the story of St. John's time on Patmos, sits right on the harbour at Scala. It's built on the site where John baptized the first converts to Christianity on the island. One of the most unusual is on a large rock formation called Kalikatsu. It sits in the bay of Petra, not far from the very popular beaches at the village of Grikos. In medieval times, monks lived as hermits in small caves hewn into the rock, and there was even a small church here in the 11th century. Also known as Petra Rock, it's thought that the ancient residents of Patmos used the flat platform at the top as a place to worship Selene, the goddess of the moon. The monks carved steps into the rock, and the views of the bay from the top make the tricky climb well worth the effort. Another distinctive architectural feature of Patmos, as on many of the Greek islands, is its cylindrical stone windmills. These are from the 16th and 17th centuries and were carefully positioned to make the most of the prevailing northerly winds. Unlike in northern Europe, fabric sails were used instead of rigid vanes, but the effect was the same, driving a large grinding wheel to make flour from wheat, barley, or corn. After being abandoned in the 1950s and becoming derelict, these 3 windmills on the edge of Hora have been lovingly restored and are in working order today. St. John lived on Patmos for around 18 months, and after the Emperor Domitian was murdered in AD 96, it's believed he was returned to his home in Ephesus, leaving this little island a remarkable legacy, which has profoundly influenced its existence today. Beyond this, he left Christianity with an even more enduring legacy, which continues to underpin the faith in the most trying of times. There can be few places on the planet that compare to Patmos for its intoxicating mix of deep spirituality, sheer physical beauty, and wonderfully relaxed lifestyle. Devout Greeks believe that you should visit Patmos at least once in your lifetime, and it's hard not to agree. But sadly, it is here that we must leave Greece and its living history. From Christianity's first tentative steps into Europe, when St. Paul must have felt on many occasions overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead, to the resounding reassurances awaiting the faithful as revealed to St. John, as he too must have been struggling with his situation on Patmos, Greece is hugely significant in biblical terms. Athens, Thessaloniki, Veria, Philippi, Corinth, and Patmos are all very significant places in the New Testament story, but if St. Paul was to visit Greece today, he would surely be astounded at how Christianity is such an integral part of the nation's life, from the major urban centers to the remotest of islands. But then perhaps he wouldn't be. Perhaps Paul's faith was always strong enough to believe that the message he brought just could not be ignored. And St. John's visions of the future must have convinced him too that what he was writing had implications for eternity. These were real people, and these are real places, which you can visit today for a truly inspirational experience. The ancient Bible destinations are a trip of a lifetime, or very possibly a life-changing trip.
O God who brings comfort, O God who sends grace, grace for the weary and mercy for me, who heals and restores like the sun and the rain, to soften these storms.